Willow Glen was a quiet neighborhood, a small, picturesque community known for its tree-lined streets and close-knit families. But on a rainy autumn night, everything changed. Laura Penning, a young woman cherished for her kindness and gentle spirit, was found dead in her own home with a single gunshot wound to the head. The image was as shocking as it was puzzling. Laura's body lay on the cold bathroom floor, her right arm splayed at an unnatural angle, while her left hand loosely held a small pistol. She had been right-handed all her life. It was Dr. Michael Edwards, a respected local physician and Laura's close friend, who made the initial call to the police. He claimed he'd come over after a late-night phone call from Laura, who was distraught after a heated argument with her boyfriend, Sean Wilson. Edwards explained to the police that he had come to check on her, to offer his help. He recounted hearing nothing unusual as he entered the house, but admitted feeling a sense of dread. It was only when he made his way into the bathroom that he discovered Laura's lifeless body. When officers arrived, they found Edwards sitting in silence by the curb, his hands trembling as he tried to explain what had happened. He painted a picture of an emotional evening gone wrong, of a heartbroken woman struggling under the weight of a toxic relationship, but something about the scene unsettled the detectives. Laura's left hand clutched the weapon, a critical detail that didn't sit right. Detectives Mark Rivers and Lynna Holloway, seasoned investigators in Willow Glen's crime unit, combed through the house, searching for clues. A quick survey of the scene revealed a smattering of details that were not easily explained. There was no sign of a struggle in the main rooms, but the bathroom door had signs of forced entry, as if someone had broken it open. Rivers noted a faint scuff mark on the doorframe, the kind that suggested a quick, forceful push. Their unease only grew as they reviewed the SECT footage from a bar near Laura's house. There, they watched a tense exchange between Edwards and Wilson. The two men, who had never gotten along, seemed locked in an increasingly aggressive confrontation. The footage, taken only a few days before Laura's death, showed Edwards attempting to de-escalate an argument, but his expression was one of barely restrained anger. The confrontation had drawn enough attention that nearby patrons could be seen glancing over, whispering. Edwards' claim of innocence was undercut by the growing list of questions. The nature of his relationship with Laura had shifted in recent months. She confided to friends that she and Edwards had rekindled a close bond, despite his marriage. Laura, known for her loyalty, had never been one to interfere in a marriage, yet she had been seen with Edwards more often recently, sparking rumors in the community. Laura's autopsy report arrived swiftly. The gunshot wound was indeed the cause of death, but the angle raised eyebrows. The shot was fired from a position that would have been awkward for a right-handed person holding a gun in their left hand. Furthermore, gunpowder residue was found on Laura's left hand, as expected, but forensic analysis indicated it was lighter than typically expected in a self-inflicted wound. The autopsy's findings shifted the investigation from a potential suicide to a likely homicide. Detectives Rivers and Holloway dug deeper into Laura's recent life. They began interviewing those closest to her, hoping to uncover anything that might explain her death. Her friends described her as kind and honest, an empathetic soul who often took on other people's troubles as her own. But they also noted a change in her demeanor in the weeks leading up to her death. She'd become withdrawn, a shadow of her usual self, struggling with a situation that few understood fully. One name came up repeatedly: Michael Edwards. Edwards had been Laura's friend for years, but in the weeks before her death, he had become her confidant. Witnesses recalled seeing the two of them together on numerous occasions at restaurants, coffee shops, and even late-night drives. Edwards had a reputation as a respected doctor and a family man, but his marriage had grown strained, with whispers around Willow Glen suggesting his frequent absences. As the detectives examined Michael's background, they noticed contradictions in his statements. Edwards claimed to have been at home when Laura called him, but cell phone records revealed he had been in the vicinity of her house much earlier in the evening than he initially admitted. Additionally, the forced entry marks on the bathroom door began to loom large. Holloway, in particular, fixated on this detail, believing it held the key to understanding what really happened that night. Meanwhile, Sean Wilson, Laura's boyfriend, was also placed under intense scrutiny. Known for a quick temper and a possessive streak, he had a history of volatile relationships. Witnesses recalled loud arguments between him and Laura, particularly in the final days before her death. Sean's version of events on the night of Laura's death suggested he was at a friend's house, but his alibi seemed shaky. The police found text messages between him and Laura laden with accusatory language and veiled threats. The detectives were caught between two plausible suspects, each with motive and opportunity. Sean's jealousy was no secret, but Michael Edwards had a more complex connection to Laura, one that seemed entangled in unresolved emotions. As Rivers and Holloway probed further, they uncovered discrepancies in Michael's timeline and inconsistencies in Sean's statements. The investigation stalled, torn between the two men who had been closest to Laura in the days before her death. Then a small but crucial discovery changed the course of the case. Holloway found fingerprints on the bathroom door, one set belonging to Michael and another set unknown. The implication was clear: someone else had been in the room or near it that night, potentially altering the crime scene. Detectives Rivers and Holloway now faced the mystery of the unknown fingerprints. They quickly ran the prints through the local database, hoping for a match. Meanwhile, they revisited the strained relationship between Laura and Sean. Sean had been known to display possessive behavior, often showing up unexpectedly at Laura's workplace or calling her multiple times a day. His last message to Laura, sent hours before her death, hinted at another argument: "We need to talk tonight." With both Sean and Michael under the microscope, Rivers and Holloway decided to dig deeper into Michael Edwards' life. The renowned doctor appeared stable on the surface: a good job, a family, a respected role in Willow Glen's tight-knit community. But beneath that image was a marriage slowly unraveling. Michael's wife, Linda Edwards, had left town a week prior, taking their two young children to stay with her parents, citing personal space as her reason. The detectives saw this as a red flag, pointing to possible turmoil in Michael's personal life. Linda's absence fueled their suspicion that Michael's relationship with Laura was more than just friendly. Holloway found texts between Laura and Michael that were far more intimate than the usual exchanges between friends. Some texts were cryptic, discussing second chances and not making the same mistakes. Laura's friends confirmed she had confessed to feeling reignited by Michael's presence in her life, yet her confessions were laced with guilt, as though she knew she was treading dangerous ground. When the lab results for the fingerprints came back, they pointed to a man named Jared Lucas, a known handyman in the area with a minor criminal record. Rivers and Holloway tracked him down and questioned him extensively. Lucas admitted he'd been hired to work on repairs at Laura's house weeks earlier. He claimed that on the night of her death, he hadn't been anywhere near Willow Glen. However, he stumbled under questioning, visibly nervous, and couldn't provide a clear alibi. His story of being at a bar was weak, with no witnesses to back it up. Intriguingly, Lucas and Michael Edwards had crossed paths years ago when Lucas had briefly worked as a groundskeeper at the Edwards property. The investigators suspected there might be a deeper link between the two men. Under mounting pressure, Lucas eventually cracked, admitting he'd been hired for a job at Laura's house but revealing no specifics beyond that. This raised more questions. What job could Michael Edwards have enlisted a man like Lucas to carry out? As Rivers and Holloway continued to piece the story together, they discovered additional SEC footage from the night Laura died, capturing the streets near her home. The footage revealed an unidentified figure standing in the shadows near her property shortly before Michael arrived. Though grainy, the figure's clothes and stature appeared similar to Lucas's, adding weight to the theory that he had indeed been involved that night. Yet what his involvement entailed remained unclear. The detectives pressed on with this new lead, speculating that Michael, facing the collapse of his marriage and his own attraction to Laura, might have reached a breaking point, but the details didn't fit perfectly. Rivers, increasingly wary, began to wonder if they were missing a critical piece. Why would a man like Michael involve a low-level handyman in something so volatile? And if Lucas was there, had he witnessed something? Or worse, had he been an accomplice? With fresh urgency, the detectives analyzed the timelines of all the key players. They noted that Michael's initial account, his arrival shortly after Laura's death, left a small but suspicious window of unaccounted time. If he had arrived earlier, it could imply he was already in the house or lurking nearby. Holloway, growing more skeptical, speculated that Michael had orchestrated the crime to appear as a suicide, exploiting Laura's known struggles with Sean to fabricate a plausible motive. In an unexpected twist, the detectives discovered Laura's car parked near Sean's apartment on the afternoon of her death. The car's position suggested that Laura had visited Sean that day, adding a new wrinkle to the story. Had she gone to Sean's to mend things? Or was it a final confrontation? Sean, when re-questioned, maintained that they'd parted on neutral terms. But in this second interview, he revealed something he had previously omitted: a strange call he'd received from an unknown number that afternoon. The caller hadn't spoken, but the silence lingered, heavy and menacing. Rivers had the call traced, and the number led back to a burner phone registered under a fake name. The detectives dug into nearby cell towers and realized that the burner phone had pinged near Michael's clinic only hours before Laura's death. Convinced now of Michael's involvement, Holloway pieced together a hypothesis. Michael might have used Lucas to monitor Laura and Sheen, planting seeds of paranoia to make her feel increasingly isolated. The missing piece, though, was why he would have wanted Laura dead. If he harbored true affection for her, what could have driven him to violence? In an attempt to break Lucas down, Holloway brought him in for questioning once more. This time, Rivers laid out the mounting evidence, the fingerprints, the SECT footage, and a recording of the burner phone call. Under relentless questioning, Lucas confessed. Michael had indeed approached him with an unusual job offer to follow Laura and report back any interactions with Sean. Michael seemed driven by jealousy, Lucas explained, speaking vaguely about protecting her but becoming increasingly agitated when talking about Sean. As Lucas recounted the events leading up to that night, he admitted that Michael had pressured him to be on standby in case things got out of control. When Rivers pressed further, Lucas muttered that he'd been nearby the house when he heard the gunshot. Panicked, he'd entered through the already broken bathroom door, finding Michael standing over Laura's body. The chilling confession filled in many gaps, but left one question unanswered. Had Michael fired the fatal shot, or had he forced Laura's hand in some way? As the story took shape, the detectives saw how deeply Michael's obsession had entangled Laura's life, creating a dark web of surveillance and control that ultimately led to her death. But with Lucas's statement, the puzzle pieces finally began to coalesce, casting Michael as the orchestrator and perhaps even the executioner in a tragic tale of betrayal. The detectives now had enough to bring Michael in for a formal arrest. But as they prepared to confront him, Rivers felt an unease settling over him. The psychological complexity of the case weighed heavily, and he wondered if Michael, even now, believed himself to be innocent of murder. Holloway's determination never wavered. She saw Michael as a man who had let his fixation drive him to irreversible actions, regardless of whether he pulled the trigger or not. The day Michael Edwards was brought in for questioning, Willow Glen was eerily quiet. Rumors of his arrest swept through the community, casting a pall over the once respected doctor's reputation. Residents were stunned. Few could reconcile the image of the dedicated physician with the shocking story of obsession and betrayal now unfolding in front of them. Detectives Rivers and Holloway approached the interrogation with a firm strategy. They had evidence linking Michael to the crime scene, a confession from Lucas implicating him in surveillance activities, and the damning inconsistencies in his timeline. However, Michael sat across from them, stone-faced and composed, his practiced professionalism shielding him from their probing questions. When Rivers confronted him with the forensic details, emphasizing the awkward angle of the gun and the lack of sufficient gunpowder residue, Michael's expression flickered a brief crack in his mask. Holloway, seizing the opportunity, brought up Lucas's statement, pressing Michael to explain why he had hired someone to follow Laura. His answer was unsettlingly calm. He claimed that he was simply watching out for her, attempting to ensure her safety from what he described as the threat of Sean Wilson. Rivers leaned in, presenting Michael with the series of damning phone records showing the burner phone's movements and how they aligned with both Michael's clinic and Laura's home. He didn't flinch, but instead insisted that his intentions were misunderstood. According to him, he had only hired Lucas to ensure that Sean didn't harm Laura, a line of reasoning that made little sense given Lucas's admission of Michael's jealous outbursts. When Holloway pushed further, challenging him on the increasingly personal nature of his relationship with Laura, Michael's tone changed. He admitted almost defensively that he had felt deeply for her, calling their bond unique and special. His calm demeanor cracked further when Holloway directly asked if he had been in love with Laura. In response, he fell silent, looking away. That silence was the closest he came to admitting what they already knew, that his feelings had crossed a line long before Laura's death. Eventually, Michael was led away to a holding cell, leaving Holloway and Rivers with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. They had their man, but the troubling web of control he had spun around Laura haunted them. They could see how she had been trapped by his fixation, a victim in a deadly game where her trust and kindness were used against her. In the days that followed, the case quickly escalated to the district attorney's office, where a decision was made to pursue charges of second-degree murder. Michael's defense attorney, a sharp and determined man named Joel Hargrove, argued fiercely that Michael had only acted as a concerned friend, implying that Laura's death could have been a suicide spurred by her troubled relationship with Sean Sham. The narrative painted by the defense portrayed Laura as a woman on the edge, haunted by personal demons and struggling under the weight of an unhealthy romance. The prosecution, however, had built a powerful case against Michael. They outlined how his obsession grew over time, eventually manifesting in a plot to control and isolate Laura. They illustrated how Michael's feelings toward her had warped into a fixation so consuming that he couldn't bear the thought of her choosing anyone else, especially Sean. To bolster their case, the prosecution introduced a forensic psychologist who testified about the paradoxical rage often observed in obsessive personalities, where love and jealousy combine to create a dangerous cocktail. In February 2024, Michael Edwards' trial began, drawing the attention of both the media and the public. Willow Glen residents filled the courtroom, anxious to witness the proceedings that would bring clarity, or so they hoped, to the mystery of Laura's tragic death. Journalists from across the state arrived, covering every angle of the trial in sensational headlines that underscored the once trusted doctor's fall from grace. The prosecution opened by establishing a timeline of events, carefully detailing how Michael's relationship with Laura had escalated in the months before her death. They recounted how he had taken increasing control over her life, inserting himself into her world under the guise of friendship, only to become a constant presence, especially after her on-again, off-again arguments with Sean. They presented witnesses who described Michael's temper as well as his unsettling fixation on Laura. Several friends testified that Laura had confided in them, expressing her discomfort over the intensity of Michael's attention, though she had never believed him capable of violence. She had once even joked that Michael knew her every move, unaware of how literal that would prove to be. One of the most damning moments came when the prosecution played sect footage showing Michael and Sean's confrontation in the bar days before Laura's death. In it, Michael's expression was dark, his words muffled but clearly hostile as he leaned towards Sean, invading his personal space. Witnesses testified that Michael had warned Sean to stay away from Laura, his tone bordering on threatening. When Lucas took the stand, his testimony riveted the courtroom. He described how Michael had hired him to monitor Laura and Sean, outlining how his role was supposed to be limited to keeping an eye out. But Lucas admitted that Michael's demands had grown more aggressive over time. According to Lucas, Michael had often checked in obsessively, pushing him to monitor Laura more closely. The climax came when Lucas recounted how, on the night of Laura's death, he'd been stationed outside her house, as instructed by Michael. He swore he heard a gunshot, and upon entering, saw Michael standing over her body. Michael's defense argued that Lucas, with his criminal record, was an unreliable witness. Joel Hargrove claimed Lucas was simply trying to shift blame away from himself, suggesting he might have had his own motives for being there. Hargrove further insinuated that Laura had been in a fragile mental state, bringing in a former therapist who testified that Laura had struggled with anxiety and stress. But Holloway and Rivers knew the power of the physical evidence. During cross-examination, the prosecution dismantled Hargrove's arguments, meticulously highlighting Michael's inconsistent statements and the odd details surrounding the crime scene: the gun in Laura's left hand, the faint residue, and the forced bathroom door. In a dramatic moment, the prosecution displayed Laura's text messages to her friends, who had saved them on their phones. These messages documented her growing fear of Michael, a fear she had tried to rationalize but could no longer ignore. Laura had written of feeling suffocated, hinting at Michael's increasingly invasive presence in her life. In the face of these testimonies, the defense's argument that Laura's death was a suicide grew weaker. Hargrove's efforts to sway the jury by portraying Michael as a concerned friend failed to overcome the weight of evidence that painted him as a man whose desire for control had spiraled out of hand. As the trial wore on, Michael's previously stoic expression began to falter. Gone was the calm, confident doctor who had initially dismissed the charges against him. Now he seemed visibly strained, his face betraying a glimmer of realization that the narrative he'd so carefully crafted over the months was unraveling, thread by thread. After weeks of testimony, the trial reached its final day. The jury listened intently as the prosecution delivered a closing argument that painted Michael Edwards as a man consumed by obsession. The prosecutor reminded the jury of the meticulously documented evidence: the fingerprints on the bathroom door, the burner phone records, and the accounts from Laura's friends. Piece by piece, it all painted a portrait of a man who'd crossed the line from care to control, and from affection to possessive rage. The defense, for its part, attempted one last appeal to reason, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial, that Michael's actions could have been misinterpreted as those of a caring friend. But as he spoke, the defense attorney's words rang hollow. Michael's own demeanor seemed to confirm his fate. He sat in silence, no longer maintaining the calm exterior that had initially masked his true feelings. The mask had slipped, revealing a man who was visibly worn down by the enormity of what he had done. When the jury was dismissed to deliberate, tension filled the courtroom. Hours passed, and the crowded room emptied out into hushed murmurs and nervous glances. Willow Glen residents anxiously awaited news, crowded outside the courthouse as media vans lined the streets. Finally, after 7 hours, the jury returned, solemn-faced and resolute. The foreman stood, clearing his throat, and announced the verdict: Michael Edwards was found guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom was silent. Michael closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, resignation etched into his face. He had lost everything: his family, his career, and the reputation he had so carefully constructed over years. As the bailiff led him away, the once respected doctor who had captivated Willow Glen's trust now seemed diminished, a shadow of the person he had once been. Outside the courthouse, Laura's friends and family embraced, some weeping openly. They had lost Laura. But in that moment, a measure of justice had been served. Willow Glen could begin to heal, though the scars would remain. In the days following the verdict, the residents of Willow Glen struggled to come to terms with the chilling events that had unraveled in their community. People who had once admired Michael Edwards now spoke of him with a mixture of fear and disbelief. How could such darkness have existed within a man so trusted, so revered? The case had shattered the town's innocence, leaving them to wrestle with the uncomfortable truth that even those closest to them might harbor secrets. Detectives Rivers and Holloway moved on to their next case, but the haunting memory of Laura Penning lingered. In the silence of the precinct, Holloway would occasionally glance at a small photo of Laura pinned to the caseboard, a reminder of the fragile line between trust and control, and the profound consequences when that line is crossed. Laura's mother organized a memorial service in Willow Glen's Central Park, where friends and family gathered to honor her memory. At the ceremony, her friends shared stories of her kindness and generosity, of the vibrant life that had been tragically cut short. The event served as a reminder of Laura's spirit, which would live on in the hearts of those who had known her. As for Michael Edwards, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Stripped of his titles and possessions, he retreated into the shadows, a figure of infamy rather than respect. He would serve his sentence in silence, haunted by the life he could have had if he had chosen a different path. The story of Laura Penning became a cautionary tale in Willow Glen, a reminder of how obsession can twist even the best of intentions into something sinister. Over time, life in the quiet neighborhood returned to a semblance of normalcy. But those who had known Laura would never forget her story, or the painful lesson it had taught them about the dangers lurking behind even the friendliest of faces. In the end, Laura's memory became a symbol of resilience, and Willow Glen slowly began to heal, united in the hope that such darkness would never again find its way into their lives.